Welcome back to the Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, broadcasting to you live from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. We have today a subject that is close to my heart. As some of you may know, I spent my adult life, in fact, I'm ashamed to say, 17 years working on a book about Watergate. It's called The Strong Man, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate. It was published 5 years ago. But really to work on the subject of Richard Nixon, and particularly the Nixon White House, is a life's work. And that's because Richard Nixon made some 3,700 hours of secret recordings in the Oval Office, the Executive Office building, Camp David, various White House telephones. Today, all but 700 hours of those recordings have been released to the public. The last such release in installments dating back to the 1990s occurred last week, with the National Archives making 340 hours of those conversations available, up to and including the very last of the Nixon tapes, July 12, 1973, a brief conversation between the President and his secretary, Rosemary Woods. We're going to talk about the Nixon tapes with the reigning expert on that subject. He is the author of 2 books. They include biographies of President Bush, 43, and Lyndon Johnson, George W. Bush, Life of Privilege, Leadership in Crisis, and Lyndon B. Johnson, Pursuit of Populism, Paradox of Power, by my friend and the historian, Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M University, Luke Nichter, who joins us from Austin, Texas. Luke, nice to have you in the Foxhole.
Hey, thanks, James. It's my pleasure.
Now, Luke is also the co-founder of a website called www.nixontapes.org. When did you found that website, and why did you do it?
Well, that website was started coincidentally on the same day that the Nixon Library came under federal control during July of 2007. And why I did it, it was never planned. The website was never in the cards. I was working on these tapes and first made offers to donate these materials to the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, to the Nixon Foundation, and to the Nixon Library at the time, because they had already done a lot of work on these tapes, and there were no takers, so I went out and did it on my own.
Now, Luke Nichter, you have to understand, folks, is the country's reigning expert on the Nixon tapes. All of the newspaper and internet coverage that you saw of this release of the Nixon tapes last week, all of the reporters who wrote those articles went to Luke Nichter and said, tell us where to go here. In 340 hours, obviously deadline-strapped reporters can't get to them all themselves. So I've asked Luke to join us here in the Foxhole to review just a few of the most interesting tapes that were released last week. We're going to start with a conversation between President Nixon and his National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, that took place in the Oval Office on May 2, 1973, a point when the Watergate scandal was really starting to explode. By this point, Nixon had had to force and accept the resignations of his 2 closest aides, White House Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman and Domestic Policy Advisor John Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman had been the leader of the group called the Plumbers, whose job in the Nixon White House was to investigate leaks of classified material to the news media. It was the Plumbers that staged the break-in at the office of the psychiatrist of the Pentagon Papers leaker, Daniel Ellsberg, and also the break-in at the Watergate office complex into the office of the Democratic National Committee. Here in this conversation, which was transcribed by me with help from Luke, Nixon and Kissinger are discussing some of the wiretapping activities and leak scandals that plagued the Nixon administration in its first term, including a situation involving Yeoman Charles Radford. Yeoman Radford in 1971 was a 27-year-old Navy-trained stenographer who was detailed to the National Security Council staff of Dr. Kissinger. It later was discovered by the Plumbers, those investigators of news leaks, that Yeoman Radford had secretly been rifling Kissinger's briefcases, his burn bags, his waste paper baskets at the NSC, and during wartime, folks, over a 13-month period, 1970 to 71, young Yeoman Radford had privately, secretly routed 5,000 documents to his superiors at the office of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's known as the Moore-Radford scandal. It is still an relatively underreported story today. It was one of the most sensitive secrets of the Nixon presidency. Let's listen as Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon on May 2, 1973 discuss all of the above.
Yeah, it's too bad Ehrlichman is so involved and that insane Ellsberg convict. You know, I remember so well. Remember how upset we were about Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers and all the rest of it. It all seems so long ago. But did anybody ever think that's difference in the public estimate whether you are investigating leaks or whether you're doing it for what seems to be political purposes.
People want leaks investigated.
So I
Don't, and it's not anybody ever actually says, but you're like we were investigating leaks. And we are continuing to.
oh yes,
Be sure to take that with anybody you talk to.
no question,
That we have to.
no
Especially leaking around the Security Council
no question.
and the State Department. Johnson's investigating them all the time. Kennedy's investigating them. And so do we.
Why can't we? I must say it's too late now. Elliot worries me. He's going to be very ambitious. He's not going to be out. I mean, the presidency, I know it's all very well to say that he should have the free hand, but you should give the free hand only to somebody who is wise enough to use it. And
By putting FBI agents on the wall.
I just don't know. From what I've seen of Elliot in
I'm
defense,
afraid that was dark. Nevertheless, it's
Elliot is out for himself.
sure is.
And Elliot will not necessarily agree that the major objective has to be to keep it away from the presidency, because all these guys have a high incentive to stump it on somebody.
Well,
True or not. I mean, it doesn't have to be true. How can one defend oneself?
sure. Well, don't be discouraged. Elliot
I am not discouraged.
was a team player, I think. When I talked to him, I'm going to talk to him very frankly. And that's just kind of let go of the idea of letting us appear at Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman are criminals. Because FBI agents standing there in the hall, I couldn't believe that. I couldn't believe it. How would you like somebody standing in front of your desk and say, boy, your paper, you were going to sneak them out in the middle of the night. Christ, they are going to sneak these papers out of this place.
So that was just under 5 minutes of audio from the Nixon tapes of May 2, 1973. The President and Henry Kissinger were joined here in the foxhole by Luke Nichter, the reigning expert on the Nixon tapes of Texas A&M University. He's joining us from Austin. Luke, your impressions from that recording?
Well, they discuss a number of issues, both contemporary issues in 1973, but they're also reminiscing about issues from a couple of years before. And, you know, one of the things that I've listened to, because I've heard enough of these tapes, is there's really a Nixon for every occasion. There are many sides to Richard Nixon, and depending on what he's talking about,